The Demon of Florence by Andrew L. Productions. Chapter 5. Goliath. She entered the dungeon cell carrying spellbooks, parchments, and the jade lion. She then placed the artifact down on the ground in formation with the other 6. All bearded heads were staring at Goliath, who remained frozen in stone. Now in formation, the lions began to glow. It's working. She opened the ancient parchment and began the incantation. The Assyrian Empire collapsed over 1,000 years before she was hatched, but she could understand several of the words as she read. Heaven, power, life. A beam of white light emerged from the jade lion and connected to the golden one on its left. The beam of light continued to move through all of the lions until a hexagon of light surrounded the stone statue in front of her. Her gaze locked on the face of her beloved. She looked for cracks in the granite, but the statue remained still. Something's missing. She looked down at her spell, hoping that there was a remaining piece of the incantation she'd forgotten to read. But she had read the spell perfectly. She opened another spell book on ancient Assyria and began flipping through it. I call upon the power of Marduk. Break this curse. But the statue remained still, although the light continued to emanate. She called upon Enlil, Enki, and Asher, but still no effect. I call upon Inanna, Queen of Heaven. The force from the circle knocked her back. Her tail instinctively pressed itself to the ground to keep her from falling over. She could feel the power flowing in the room, the way a current passes over a swimmer in an untamed river. Yes, the Queen of Heaven. Release my beloved. I command you. I beg you. Please. The light from the winged lions began to blind her. They were glowing so brightly. She had to force herself to keep her eyes open, but she saw movement. The statue was rumbling. Finally. Awake, my love, awake. But the room went dark. It took her eyes a few seconds to adjust back, but Goliath was there, still kneeling in stone. She looked down at the winged lions, which had all gone dark. Her gaze turned into a glare. Useless trinkets. She whipped her tail around and struck the golden lion, hurling it across the dungeon. She was ready to smash the jade lion, when she looked down and saw the statue was now kneeling above the circle of lions. It was levitating a foot off the ground. The realization hit her. Accessing the gates of heaven. It's nothing more than a levitation spell. To any human, the ability to levitate or fly would seem like accessing heaven, but it had no power to break the ancient curse. Forgotten gods wield feeble magic. She went back through her books, but there was nothing else. She didn't want to accept it, but she knew it to be true. She had failed. Again. Tears began to well up in her eyes. This spell had been the most promising one she had uncovered in years. She looked at Goliath with desperation and pleaded with the statue. Wake up, my love. Wake up. But nothing happened. Tears streamed down her face. I just want to be with you again. The statue began moving towards her. At first she jumped back, but the statue continued moving until it was only inches away from her face. She looked into those lifeless granite eyes. Disappointment, rage, loneliness. It all began bubbling up within her. "I can't stand the sight of you." And the statue began floating away from her face. Suddenly she became fearful that it would crash into the wall. "Stop!" And the statue did as she commanded. She motioned for the statue to go to the ground, and it did with a loud thud. She tried to console herself with the knowledge that transporting him from place to place would be considerably easier. But it was cold comfort. She had no desire to spend eternity guarding a granite statue. In the corner of her eye, she saw a rat scurrying across the dungeon, and as the rat scrambled away, she knew she was all alone. This was her life. To be companionless for eternity with only orphans and wild animals to keep her company. She turned back to the statue.
"My love, you've done your best, but now it's time to let me go."
She heard the voice of her beloved. She knew he would never want this for her, to spend centuries roaming the earth alone, tormented by past sins.
"Demona, you are immortal. But at what point does the gargoyle bond break?"
She heard his voice, but she knew it was her own heart deep down inside. The question had nagged at her for centuries. Human love had limits. Hers did not. But how long would it be before she could truly let Goliath and the others go? She wanted to scream in frustration, but only tears came forth. She balled up her hand into a fist and brought it down upon the statue. She felt the pain of striking solid granite. She did it again, harder. She struck him again and again, knowing her fist couldn't make a dent in the stone. But she was embittered and exhausted. Exhausted from failing night after night. Exhausted from years of loneliness that were eating away at her soul. She was trapped in an endless cycle of forever searching and failing, and she just wanted it to stop.
"You must free yourself from me."
She wanted to question the words of her beloved, but she knew exactly what he meant. I can't."
"You must."
The anger, the pain, the exhaustion, it all worked to stiffen her resolve. She wiped the tears from her eyes. She got up and left the dungeon cell and grabbed the battle axe off of the wall. She returned to the cell with an axe in hand.
"End my suffering. End yours."
She approached the stone statue. She narrowed her gaze onto Goliath's neck. 1 or 2 swift strikes, and his head would be severed, ensuring that he could never be brought back to life.
"I won't feel any pain. I promise."
His life ended 500 years ago. She was in love with a ghost, and this was the only way to exorcise his spirit. She raised the axe into the air.
"Do it, my love. Then you will be free."
She swung the axe into the ground. She couldn't do it. What kind of freedom would the headless statue give her? The real truth was that he was her last glimmer of hope, her last shred of conscience. To destroy him was to destroy her last connection to the mortal realm and the early life with her clan. Strike him down, and she knew she'd be truly lost in an abyss for eternity. As tears continued to stream, she left the dungeon cell. She climbed out of the cellar and ran into the library. She collapsed in front of the fireplace and continued to weep until she fell asleep. She woke up and looked around.
Hello?
Her home was pitch black, but she could clearly make out a human wearing a military uniform in her foyer. A hunter. She immediately clutched for her dagger, but realised it was upstairs. Her spells were all down in the dungeon. She would have to take him with her bare claws. She relished the challenge. And before the man knew what was happening, she rushed him, grabbed him by the neck, and squeezed. She lifted him into the air. You'll die for this transgression, hunter. He instantly began clawing at her talons, trying to break free, but it was no use. Her grip was too tight, and getting tighter. In panic, his arms and legs began flailing about. She saw the terror in his eyes, and she enjoyed it. But then she realised. His face was exposed. He wasn't wearing the signature black and red mask of the hunters. No matter. She kept squeezing. She told herself that he was an intruder, someone who had come to attack her or her beloved. He had brought it on himself. But she heard a still, small voice.
My love, this is not the gargoyle way.
But she didn't care. Goliath wasn't here to comfort her, which also meant he couldn't stop her. She kept squeezing. She knew it would all be over soon.
Demona! Enough!
She hated herself for giving in to the voice of a spectre, but she dropped the human to the floor. Who are you?
I...
Speak quickly. The man held out a piece of paper, and she snatched it out of his hand. And as the man caught his breath, he looked up, trying to make out what kind of creature had nearly killed him so easily. She couldn't have that. She spun her tail around and struck the man in the back of the head. He fell to the ground. She knelt down and put her talons to his nose. She felt warm breath emerging and knew he was still alive. She held the letter up to the moonlight. Her eyes still stung from the tears she had shed, but she could make out the writing in the darkness. It was yet another nobleman coming to her, begging her to fix his problems. She crumpled up the letter and threw it onto the floor. She picked the human up, threw him out the door and locked it. She felt annoyed with herself for letting him live. The world would be no worse off with one less human prancing about. But she knew it was what Goliath would have wanted. She picked the paper up from the ground and read it again. She knew Goliath's first instinct would be to help. He would foolishly swoop in and try to rescue the miserable politician, caring nothing about the prejudice and hatred that would greet him as a reward. He would demonstrate a pure sense of justice, a sense of compassion that only a gargoyle could have. That's what made her kind superior to humans. To help others would honour Goliath's memory, but would it atone for previous sins? Nothing can atone for Janat. But Janat was long ago and far away. There was nothing she could do about it now. However, she could do something to help this man. He could be useful. Although she wasn't sure how, but she cautioned herself to be careful. Goliath's foolishness cost him his life and the lives of her entire clan. She knew she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. A plan began to form in her mind. She would rescue the disgraced politician and save his life. but she wasn't going to do it for free. This has been The Demon of Florence by Andrew L. Productions. It was read and performed by Daisy May Parsons, with the voice talents of Elliot Crossley and Gary Scales. If you've enjoyed this broadcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a like. And if you're in a position to help, please feel free to visit our Patreon page, Andrew Creates. It really helps us out a lot. Thank you.